All right, great, thanks. Hi, everybody. Okay, the talk we've been waiting for, Scott Kratz is here, and it's really amazing. We got to hear some and have a nice conversation with you yesterday evening. Thank you, and thanks for coming from Washington, D.C. But first off, I do jump ahead because it's my honor to introduce the person who invited and will introduce our keynote speaker. This individual inspires us all and drives thoughtful design as a foundation of our built community. The soul of our industry forum, he connects us to the wider world, and he brings the wider world to Portland. And of course, he is Donald J. Stastny, FAIA. And he is busy, yes. Recognized as a leading design competition manager in North America, in the last decade, Don has executed an amazing number of projects, among them, just a few among them, an international design competition for a Cold War memorial for the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in both Chicago and Madison, Wisconsin. He led a design planning competition for Sandpoint, Idaho, to link the downtown and the waterfront, and a design competition at Portland State University addressing placemaking. Again, these are but a few of the very impactful and significant civic projects that Don has helped bring to life. And of course, the project that we'll hear more about tonight, the 11th Street Bridge Park that ties the historic town of Anacostia to the evolving development of South Washington, D.C. He serves on the board of directors for the museum at Warm Springs, working to renew the permanent exhibit there. The Oregon Military Museum, which is opening in July. Congratulations, Don. And he works on the Halprin Landscape Conservancy, working on the Market Street Connector and the renewal of the Keller Auditorium. And he's continuing to work on the Kalau Papa Memorial for the 8,000 souls buried who had leprosy on Molokai. What a diverse number of projects that you work on, Don. It really is amazing and constantly amazes me the many projects, the many efforts that you have your hand in and get to influence. It's really amazing. Lately, he's spending his time painting and sculpting and publishing booklets on his work, which you can see at the ongoing installation at Northwest by Northwest in Cannon Beach. So soon to be 82, while Don may be approaching emeritus status in his profession, he is still showing us the way. Please help me give a warm, full of heart welcome to our friend, our mentor, our leader, Don Stastny. Thank you. Hi, Don.
Well, I would say out of my wonderful professional experiences that many of you have been a part of making happen, I'm wearing a hat tonight with OWD on it, old white dude, as one of the most, is given our current DEI, I'm one of the most despised people in the world because of age and color of my skin. As many of you know, I've had the opportunity, starting with Pioneer Courthouse Square here in Portland, of managing design competitions throughout the world. And all the way from 5 embassies to different kinds of plans throughout the Northwest, as well as doing a number of Native American projects, museums, cultural centers, and really understanding kind of our indigenous folks that are very much a part of who we are and what we are. A number of years ago, we were handling a design competition in Washington, D.C. for 3 projects on the National Mall. And I was doing a exhibit at the National Building Museum, and word got to me through someone, and we still can't remember who it was, that this person wanted to talk to me and wanted to talk to me about this kind of strange idea he had. So I met with Scott Kratz at that time. And what had happened, and he'll go into this a lot more with you tonight going forward, is that they had taken a freeway out that was crossing the Anacostia River and installed a new freeway next to it. But luckily, someone intervened and they kept the buttresses. So Scott and others had this idea, could we use the buttresses to develop a park that spans the Anacostia? Now, if you know Washington, D.C., the Anacostia neighborhood is an African-American neighborhood, not economically not well at that particular time, and it was the place where Frederick Douglass used to live and then come across the bridge every day to do his duties within Washington, D.C. This area of town is developing not only as a new part of Washington, D.C., this is where the stadium is and some very strong commercial buildings, but is also this part of D.C. that is kind of away from the capital itself. So Scott had this idea about could we build a park on these buttresses, and it was a fairly simple idea at the time. We put together a competition and a process and a jury and the usual things we did, but to me it has become far more than that, because it is a bridge between communities, but it also has instilled a lot of other different ideas, from economic development to cultural development, urban farms, whatever Scott is going to tell you about tonight. And it has become a symbol of how you build communities. And when we when we proposed this idea, we said this is the type of thing that we in Portland are dealing with the bridges that we are both installing, that we're renewing, and that we're proposing. And we have to start thinking about bridges as being something more than just transportation infrastructure. But we have to really think about bridges as a way to build community, of economic development, what happens on the ends of the bridges, not just on the bridge itself, what the lane width is, or things like that. So I think it's very appropriate that we have Scott here. He's actually a Northwesterner that went back east from the Seattle area, educated down in California, educated back east, and has been working on the Bridge Park project for 11 years now. We are just about ready to go into construction, we think, with something like 13 different permits and much fundraising that Scott has been a part of. But more importantly, this is a bridge that builds community, and it brings the communities together on both sides. So when you think about our small differences, say between Portland and Vancouver, or between Washington and Oregon, I think this is a prime example of the type of thing that we should be thinking about, both as suppliers and designers and citizens of this great place. So with that, I will turn the podium over to Mr. Scott Kratz, who will talk to you about the 11th Street Bridge Park project. Scott, please.
Good evening, everybody. Happy Friday night. See if this, yep, there we go. Oh, how do we go back? There we go. It is wonderful to be back on the West Coast. As Don mentioned, I'm a creature of the West Coast, although I've made my home in Washington, D.C. for the last 19, almost 20 years. And before I begin, just a huge thank you to CSI, particularly to Don, for suggesting that I come out. It is particularly because in the last 12, 13 years that I've been working on this project, I've turned into an enormous bridge geek. And when I land here in Portland, right, having a city that embraces its infrastructure, embraces its bridges, always warms my heart. When I landed just the other day, I spent about 2 or 3 hours just walking up and down the river and taking a gazillion pictures. Because bridges are critically important, but they're not just infrastructure. These bridges are not just concrete and steel and iron. When I was preparing for this talk, I ran to this quote that I thought was a nice way to sort of frame my talk. Bridges are more than mere engineering marvels. They are symbols that connect people and places physically and metaphorically. These bridges do more than just connect you from point A to point B. Bridges can connect. They can unlock economic development like we're trying to do in Washington, D.C. They can build social cohesion, and particularly in this time that we're in right now, I think we can all agree that we need more places that can bring together people who otherwise wouldn't normally connect. We create these sort of symbols of the city. I mean, it's interesting, the hotel here that I'm staying at, all of the art sort of throughout the space has the bridges, right? They become this symbol of pride for our communities. And a big theme that I'm going to be talking about tonight is that these spaces can also repair damage that has been done in the past, and they can heal. So in my presentation tonight, I'm going to break this up into sort of 3 different parts. One is to talk about the why of what we're trying to do in Washington, D.C. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, know that this is a space that has been deeply informed and shaped at every element by local residents. I'll talk a little bit about the design of the park, and it is exciting that we're getting close to, in the next couple months, after 12, 13 years. Did not think this was going to be a 12 or 13 year effort, but every right idea is a right time. Soon we'll be soliciting our general contractor and breaking ground later this year. And then I'm going to end with how this park has become so much, as Don mentioned, has become so much more than a park, but this larger investment, not only in the bricks and mortar of the physical infrastructure, but investing in the community and the residents and the neighborhoods on both sides of the river. That has turned into a larger national template for how do you invest in underinvested neighborhoods without displacing the same residents we're trying to serve. But to begin with, I want to talk about what we're trying to solve. And when you look at this image, you can see this from an engineering perspective, this sort of beautiful 1,000-foot tall believe this is the 105, 110 interchange in Southern California, where I lived for about 20 years. But that's not how we experience these kind of places at 1,000 feet up, right? This is more of how we experience these places. And I always love/hate this picture. This is the 695 freeway in Washington, D.C. And I think of those young men sort of crossing that. I mean, how just unfriendly can you design a place to be, right? This has made this 8-lane concrete mess that has separated the nation's capital from different communities. And, these freeways did not pop up out of nowhere. In the 695 freeway example in Washington, D.C., it displaced over 21,000 individuals. The 61% of which were African Americans, right? And this is personal because that little red circle, that's where my wife and I live, by the Marine Barracks. So, this freeway that has separated the city is just a few blocks away from where we live, where we've made our home. And in Washington, D.C., like many cities, we went on a real freeway binge in the 1960s. And this is a picture of the Anacostia River, where we have separated the community not only by this natural barrier of 900 feet of water, but two different freeways, the 695 and the 295 freeways on both sides. And that has led to enormous downstream consequences. As you think about almost any statistic that you can imagine of the two communities that line the Anacostia River, again, separated by about 900 feet of water, the separation is really immense and it's catastrophic. There's nearly a $500,000 delta between homes on one side of the river and the other. There's a 15-year life expectancy difference depending on where you grew up in Washington, D.C. Think about that, 15 years, right? Our life expectancy should not be determined by our zip code and where we live. And that has an enormous additional health disparities. East of the river residents have 41.9% adult obesity rate. There's only one full-service grocery store east of the river, serving 75,000 residents. So when we think about repairing, when we think about healing with this project, these are the issues that we're trying to solve. And in our case, as Don mentioned, the 11th Street bridges, this has been a connection in Washington, D.C. for 300 years, was the old Navy Yard Bridge that connects the communities east of the river of Anacostia with the Capitol Hill and the booming area of the Navy Yard. You can see the new-ish National Stadium. They just announced the redo of the RFK Stadium just to the north, so booming areas on both sides of the river to the north of the river. And on the other side of the river, the south of the river, east of the river, a significantly underinvested neighborhood. And in our case, we had these old freeway bridges that were built in the 1960s, between 1962 and 1967, that you see in front of you, that reached the end of their lifespan. And we had this once in a lifetime opportunity where instead of blowing up and getting rid of all the old infrastructure, could we save some of that infrastructure, extend the life of that initial federal investment, but repurpose it into something that can reconnect instead of dividing the neighborhood. And when we first started working on this in 2011, 2012, we tried to see if we could save the entire structure. We thought that green deck that you see on the top, or at least I thought it had a beautiful industrial patina to it. Most people thought it was really hideous and really ugly, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But it turned out, and I've learned more about engineering than, I'm not an engineer. My background is a museum educator, so I had no idea I'd be building a bridge, but I've learned that the saving the deck that the cars would drive on would have been cost prohibitive. So we've removed the deck. But I've also learned that the most expensive part about any river bridge isn't necessarily the deck, it's the piers and the piling that hold all the load, right? The live load and the dead load. The piers are in good shape, so the piers have been saved. And we will build a new deck that's on top that no longer holds cars or tractor trailers, but that will hold community-generated programming spaces. All of this is to create a space that has 4 key goals. These have been our 4 table legs that have been holding up the project from the beginning. To re-engage the residents with the Anacostia River, as I mentioned, to address some of those health disparities. The goal that most viscerally is connect with residents from the beginning is that physical and metaphorical bridging, and stitching together the city, healing the city. And finally, and I'll talk about this at the end of the presentation, how do we make sure that this bridge is not just an anchor for economic growth, but just an inclusive economic growth? So when we first started this work, back in 2011, before we engaged any architects, landscape architects, before we engaged Don as our design competition, the consultant, I was working as the vice president for education at the National Building Museum, and I was working on this part-time, these sort of nights and weekends, volunteering. And we really wanted to make sure that we heard from the future users of this park. So I took 2 weeks off from my day job as the Vice President for Education, and we engaged about 36 local youth from both sides of the river. And I called in every favor that I could, and I brought in planners and architects and landscape architects and engineers to work with these young men and women whose task was, over the course of 2 to 3 weeks, to create their own designs for the park, because these are going to be the future users, right? Them and their kids. Hardest 2 or 3 weeks that I've ever worked in a vacation before in my life. But these young men and women came up with these amazing designs that were the inspiration for a larger design competition. And we went out and we talked to the community. We had over 200 meetings those first 2 years with local residents to say, not necessarily, sometimes I think when these projects come into a community, it starts with the design renderings, right? But sometimes when design renderings are done, the cake has been baked 80, 90%. And it was important for a community that has an enormous and justifiable trust deficit to take several steps back and to come into the community and ask, is this even something that the community wanted? In essence, sort of asking for permission. And we had a lot of meetings in church basements and cafes and sitting around the kitchen coffee table. It was critical as we went through this larger work of not do the show up at the public meeting at Tuesday afternoon, right? But try and remove as many barriers as we could between true participation in this process. So not asking people to come to one more meeting, but show up at existing meetings, provide childcare and food. You know, if we're asking for sustained work and effort and intellectual brain power from our community, we need to make sure we compensate them, right? I would never ask a consultant to come down and work for free from New York, but oftentimes that's what we ask of the community all the time, right? So we need to pay them. And then making sure in a community that has that significant mistrust, making sure that we're showing the results and building their ideas into the design. And interestingly, even though both sides of the river were very different, we kept hearing the same programming ideas, these ideas that you see on the screen, from the Capitol Hill residents, the Navy Yard residents, and Anacostia and Fairlawn residents. So we took these ideas. I made one of my smarter moves of hiring Don to come in and run an international design competition. We had over 81 firms from across the globe participate. And we did something that was a little unique where, in many of the other design competitions that I was looking at, sometimes the designers have no connection to the client, more or less the community, and that didn't make any sense to us. So we created something that we called our Design Oversight Committee. This was a group of about 36 local residents and key stakeholders, and their role was to review the design brief before a single design team saw it. They met with our 4 final design teams at multiple times during the design process to help shape and provide feedback. And at the end of this 8-month design competition, they made a formal recommendation to our jury for the design team. So when we talk about putting that decision-making power in the hands of local residents, right, it wasn't me who was making the decision. I didn't get to vote, right? It was the community that got to make this final recommendation to the jury, and it turned out that the design was completely unanimous. The design was for the architecture firm of OMA out of New York and the landscape architecture firm of Olin out of Philadelphia. And their design was elegant and simple. It was 2 trusses that are reusing the old piers and meeting in the center of the bridge. That makes way for all of the programming that the community requested. In other words, a double-decked park right over perched over the Anacostia River. So I'm going to take you now on a quick walk over the bridge. Starting on the Navy Yard side, we are capturing 100% of the stormwater for the park in giant 25,000-gallon cistern on one side of the river and a 30,000-gallon cistern on the other side of the river that we're going to be reusing for irrigation. The entire park, since we're over the Anacostia River, which once was the most polluted river in the United States, that now this year, due to decades of work, will be swimmable and fishable. It's quite a remarkable turnaround. The entire park should be a model for environmental sustainability. The trusses on either side get you up high enough, 65 feet above ground. You get these stellar views of Washington, D.C. You can see all the way to National Airport, the Air Force Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Building. center gathering place that we call Anacostia Plaza, named and honoring for the Native Americans that lived there for thousands of years before us, the Nacotchtank or the Anacostans. This is a place where the two trusses come together. That's a programmatical space for art fairs and concerts and the like. A hammock grove, a place not only of physical well-being, but mental relaxation. There's lots of places that you can cross the river in Washington, D.C., either the Potomac or the Anacostia, but not many you can stop and linger and take in the views, right? Read a Sunday morning newspaper. In the center of the bridge, just adjacent to Anacostia Plaza, is a community meeting space, what we call our town hall, and a cafe to grab a cup of coffee, a drink, take in the sunset. A community front porch that the designers did an amazing job of creating these small, medium, and large programming spaces sort of strewn throughout the park. And on the top of the community room and the cafe and the community front porch is in essence a giant occupiable green roof that we call our Great Lawn. Coming down towards the Anacostia side, but still on the park, is, if I'm allowed favorites on the park, this is my favorite space. It's Mussel Beach, not mussel, but Mussel, named for the native bivalves that are helping to clean the river and pull toxins from the river. Our partners at the Anacostia Watershed Society have installed over 60,000 native mussels in the river, and we're seeing now subaquatic vegetation come back, which is really quite remarkable. The anchoring the east side of the river will be an environmental education center that will inspire the next generation of river stewards, tour DCPS and DC charter school kids and kids from around the region to understand the river's flora and fauna. The Anacostia Watershed Society will also be running a kayak and canoe launch because once you get out on the river, and maybe it's the same way here in Portland, but you start to experience the space in a totally different way. I kayak on the river on a pretty regular basis, and my kayak is just upriver from here. When I'm out there kayaking in the nation's capital and I see great blue herons, I see bald eagles that have returned to the Anacostia River, and you're in the nation's capital and you see a bald eagle like flying over your head. It's like stepping into a National Geographic special. I've even seen what I thought was the largest rat that I've ever seen before in my life, until I saw its tail and I realized it was a beaver. We both totally freaked each other out, but beavers have come back on the Anacostia River. And the thing I've become totally fascinated with is just last year, the first river otters have been spotted coming back into the Anacostia River, which is an enormous indicator species for the revitalization of the health of the river. We'll have urban agriculture on the park, addressing that food injustice that I mentioned of having only one grocery store serving 75,000 residents. And then on terra firma, on the east side of the river, we'll have a 250-seat outdoor amphitheater that actually can expand up to over 1,000 seats that can celebrate the rich history, culture, and narratives of Washington, D.C., and particularly the east of the river communities. And all told, it's about a 10-acre park. This is the view looking back towards the Capitol. I'm very happy to share that after 12, 13 years, we're at 100% design. We're out of our 30 permits that we've needed for this project, 30, count them. We're about to finalize our last permit and begin our solicitation for the general contractor next month in June, and then break ground end of summer, fall, and then open up in early 2028. Very exciting. But we're not just working quietly in our offices. We're out there testing and piloting some of these programming ideas. So in the rare case of anybody's in Washington, D.C. next Saturday, you have a personal invitation to come to our 11th annual Anacostia River Festival. For the last 11 years, we've brought together the entire city along the banks of the river and set up a kayak and canoe launch just exactly where the canoe launch is going to be, a stage exactly where the stage is going to be. And we bring about 10,000 people down to the banks of the river to really celebrate the Anacostia and the communities that line its banks. We've started well in advance of the park even breaking ground. We've stood up 7 urban farms in Southeast DC to again address that food, the insecurity. We harvest all of those foods that is grown in collaboration with communities of faith and nonprofits for a giant farmers market that we hold every Friday. We're kicking off our first one of the season in 2 Fridays. It's called Food and Farm Fridays, but we removed the barrier of cost, so everything is totally free. We served about 3,000 residents last year. We've started growing, in addition to mussels, which I've become totally fascinated with, we started growing during the pandemic mushrooms. So we harvested about 150 pounds of shiitake mushrooms last year that we were able to distribute. That's JJ, our senior farm manager at the Ark Farm, with a shiitake mushroom log. And then at the end of the season, we host this it's one of my favorite events, this beautiful event where we bring together about 750 local residents for a sit-down dinner in the woods along the creek, called our Taste of the Harvest Festival. And it's magical with the little fairy lights wrapped up in the trees. It's really quite remarkable. But when we were out there talking to the community and we were asking, well, what should be on this park? And we baked all those ideas into the design competition, we heard a much deeper need. We heard a need for housing. We heard a need for jobs. We heard a need for supporting small businesses, right? We saw other projects that were being built at the same time that when they were constructed would increase property values anywhere from 40 to 100%, right? And have unintended consequences of displacing the same residents we were trying to serve. And it was critical that the tens of thousands of residents who shaped every single element of this park are the ones that can benefit from it. We talked last night at a dinner about 2 questions that rattle around our Bridge Park staff a lot, which is who this project is for and who will benefit, 2 slightly different but related questions. And so we spent, right after the design competition in 2015, we thought to ourselves, there has to be another way to think about these kind of investments. And we spent a year in 2015 bringing together stakeholders, doing a larger asset map of existing nonprofits who were there in the community, talking to the city, to philanthropy, to existing businesses, to come up with a series of strategies focused on the 1 mile area around the park. That's the map that you see in front of you, to invest with 3 different, the 3 sort of key elements: investing early, right, before the park is even built. Because once the park is built, this will bring tremendous value, but then the market's going to move much faster than we could respond to it. 2 is be intentional, right? We need to widen the aperture of these kind of projects and think much more widely than just the physical infrastructure of the park. And 3, make sure that the community is at the center, helping to drive each of these strategies. So in December 2015, we launched our first community preservation plan, a series of economic strategies, and I won't go through all 34 of them, but I'm going to mention just a few to give you a flavor. Over the last 7-8 years, we've been running East of the River Homebuyers Club that's seen 167 East of the River resident renters become homeowners, capturing intergenerational wealth. We're now offering down payment assistance and closing cost assistance, cash grants that can be an enormous barrier for first-time homeowners. We've stood up a community land trust, the Douglas Community Land Trust, that now has over 260 units of permanently affordable housing. It's now its own separate 501c3, but we've raised millions of dollars for early property acquisition. If we're building this big, beautiful park, we want to make sure that it's local residents who are building this. But to do that, we need to make sure that the local residents have the skill set and capacity to apply for and get these jobs, right? So today, the back east in Washington, D.C., we just began our 40th construction training program, right? Keep in mind, the park hasn't even broken ground yet, right? But we've placed over 500 local residents in construction jobs. So if the general contractor comes to me this fall and says, well, Scott, I can't find any local residents to hire, we can say, well, here's a list of 500 people that we've trained and are placed in construction jobs. Try again and try a little harder, right? But the time to have these conversations is not at the shovel breaking. It's well in advance of the park opening up. And we're really tripling down on supporting small businesses. This park will bring 1 million visitors a year to this area, right? And it lands in historic Anacostia, right at the intersection of the two most important commercial the corridors of Marion Barry Jr. Avenue and MLK. And so how can we work well in advance of the park opening up to strengthen the businesses that are there? So we've done several different interventions, two of which I'll mention. We just launched our third cohort of a big collaboration that we have with the consulting firm Booz Allen, where we are providing a year's worth of pro bono technical assistance for 10 businesses east of the river to work on things like back of house financial services, or being in a better position to apply for grants, or building a new website. And each of those small businesses received cash grants between $8,000 and $10,000 to help implement those strategies. 2 months ago, we wrapped up our second cohort, and all the businesses were testifying, and I was adding up sort of all of the grants that these businesses received. These businesses, just in the second cohort alone, received over $1 million in grants from local government, from federal government, from philanthropy, right, that is investing straight into this neighborhood. And 2 years ago, we launched a mobile small business kiosk that we commissioned. We call it the Bridge Spot. So it's sort of like an Airstream trailer that eventually will run around on the park, right, and support east of the river businesses and tap into those 1 million visitors a year. But I'm impatient, and I didn't want to wait for the park to open. So we launched this 2 years ago. We're just about to, actually next weekend, we'll launch our second mobile kiosk that every month supports a different small business from DC, and we bring it around the city. We bring it to the downtown National Barbecue Battle on Pennsylvania Avenue. We bring it to the downtown holiday market, and each of these small businesses receives pro bono technical assistance from a separate team from Accenture, as well as cash grants to help pay for their staff. In our first community preservation plan, we were focused on housing and workforce and small business, which is important, but we made a mistake. We left out arts and culture, right? And we can get all those other things right, but if we lose what makes the neighborhood unique, if we lose what makes Anacostia, that also has enormous downstream consequences. So we learned from that, and we wrote our second community preservation plan. And we have invested over $4 million to date in public art that lines the bank and acts as cookie cutters, cookie crumbs to come down from the river from the adjacent neighborhoods. And 2 years ago, we commissioned major pieces of art for the park. The picture that you see in front of you is by a mother-daughter duo, Jackson Jarvis Studios, based in DC, that was selected by the community. The local residents selected all of the art. It's a $400,000 piece of sculpture called Anacostia Sunrise Sunset Portals. It'll be the first thing you see when you come down to the park. We just received a grant for all of the artists, so all of the artists are under contract and beginning their work, which is very exciting. And just last year, we added in a fifth category focused on health, wellness, and environmental justice. So in addition to all of our farm work that we have, we're doing monthly programming in Anacostia Park and down by the Anacostia River. To date, we've invested a little over $100 million in these community preservation strategies. Now, keep in mind that the entire park will cost about $95 million to build, right? So we've already invested more in the local neighborhoods than it will cost to build the park, right, on a more than one-on-one basis. And again, well in advance of the park opening up. This community preservation work has always meant to be a dynamic and organic document. So when we hear needs that are coming from the community, we see where we can stand up and help. And a few years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine, a leader on the east of the river, who made an offhanded comment that her neighbor does not have air conditioning. And by law in Washington, D.C., rental apartments need to have heat but not air conditioning. And in Ward 8, east of the river, on average, it is 13 degrees warmer than other parts of the city. 13 degrees, right? So for this woman's apartment, who's a next door neighbor of a friend of mine, her indoor temperature for her house could reach 115 degrees, right? So I said, we have to be able to fix this, right? Or at least make an intervention. So we started a program last year where we provided high energy efficient air conditioning units at no cost to local residents. It has been such a success that we're expanding that, where we are now installing over 60 AC units in Ward 8 families, which is very exciting. And the last program that I'll mention, during the pandemic, We were deeply concerned that the east of the river residents were going to be disproportionately impacted by COVID. That unfortunately came to pass because the east of the river residents were the ones that were working in the grocery stores, they were delivering our mail, right? They were keeping our city running. And so we banded together, we put a pause on the capital campaign for the construction of the park, and we banded together with 3 other amazing place-based nonprofits, Bread for the City, Far Southeast Family Strengthening Collaborative, and Martha's Table, to launch what became the largest unconditional cash transfer program that's ever been attempted in the United States. So we provided $5,500 in cash to over 650 east of the river residents, no strings attached, along with weekly groceries, monthly dry goods, and connected them with navigators. Now, what does that have to do with building a bridge, launching the largest privately funded unconditional cash transfer program? Kind of everything, right? I mean, when you're there and you're widening that aperture and you're listening deeply to the community on what it is that they need, we need to step up and act on it. And the Thrive East of the River program is one of the programs that it's been such an honor to work on. This was never the larger plan, but we're now advising similar technical assistance to about a dozen similar projects that are investing in underinvested neighborhoods, right, that are aiming to create their own community-driven economic strategies. We are currently working with 5 different communities across the United States in Columbus, Mississippi, in Baltimore, Maryland, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan, and Cleveland, Tennessee, where over the course of this year, we're going to be working with these different nonprofits to engage with their own local residents, engage with their own citizens, engage with their own city officials, philanthropy, to create their own community preservation plans, their own economic strategies, because we all shouldn't be making the same mistake at the same time across the country, right? And as we have learned from our colleagues around the country, if we can share with others and help them push up the learning curve, all the better for it. So we've learned a ton of lessons as we've gone through this larger work, engaging the community at every step. Key to this is trust, building trust in the community, particularly for a community that has this deep trust deficit, right? And trust is about shared experiences over time, building these personal relationships, and most importantly, keeping your word. Much of this work is not done by us ourselves, but a larger coalition of nonprofits, right? Where we need to break down our silos. We have to stop thinking about housing in its own bucket, separate from workforce, separate from supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs. I think the special sauce of the Community Preservation Plan and the larger 11th Street Bridge Park is connecting all of these in a multi-sector investment, right? All of which has been measured from the beginning by a senior team from the Urban Institute, organization that was started by President Johnson in the 1960s. Because Scott Kratz can say this is the best thing since sliced bread, but having a third party that takes a real critical look and tells us what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong is really important. And finally, in our latest community preservation plan, we are taking a much deeper look about how do these investments impact policy in the city? So we've widened our aperture even bigger because in the next 5 or 10 years, there's over $3.5 to $4 billion of investments that's coming east of the river. Let me say that again, $3.5 to $4 billion of investment. It's like a once in a 3 generations opportunity to get this right or not, right? So if we're really looking at making long-term change, it needs to be impacting how the city is approaching this work. So as I wrap up, a couple of thoughts to sort of leave you with, and then I'm happy to take questions. It occurs to me sort of in the conversations that I've had here in Portland, and certainly the conversations that we've been having in Washington, D.C., that both Portland and Washington, D.C. are at this real inflection point, and perhaps cities across the country, right? Of what is our future? How do we make sure that we are thinking about creating more connected, just, and resilient communities, right? And I think we collectively, everybody in this room in the design field is uniquely positioned to help be conveners, help be community organizers, help come up with bold ideas for creating our larger future, right? So that we can ultimately build many more bridges, both physically and metaphorically. So thank you again for inviting me out here. It's been a real pleasure being here in Portland, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Any questions? Yes. Yeah, so did everyone hear that? What were in thinking of both sides of the bridge and the cultural factors on both sides of the bridge, like, and if I can extrapolate a little bit more, how to make sure that the bridges are both reflective of the communities on both sides of the river, as well as, and I'll take it a next step, how do we make sure that they're deeply stitched in and to the adjacent neighborhoods? The thing that I found totally fascinating with working on this project before we did the design competition is when we went out, and we've had over 1,000 meetings with the community, right? We stopped counting after 1,000. Is when we kept asking what the community wanted on both sides of the river for what was on this park, we kept hearing the same ideas again and again. I thought there were going to be two totally different sets of ideas, right? We kept hearing the idea of performance space, of a cafe, of public art that can amplify local residents, right? A safe place to play for kids. And so that was very harmonious. That made it very easy to sort of stitch together the sides of the city. But we also want to make sure that we're honoring and we're respecting that deep culture that exists on both sides of the river. And I'll give you one example. On the west side of the river, there is the oldest African-American-owned yacht club in the United States, Seafarers Yacht Club, where Eleanor Roosevelt had to intercede with the Department of Interior to give them the lease, because the Department of Interior did not want to give a lease to a group of African-American boat owners, right? It's still an active and thriving the community, and so one of the ideas we have of commissioning additional art and weaving that into our Muscle Beach, right, to make sure that we are not just having a stuck in time moment, right, but we're amplifying the stories that were there and are there today. We've been much more my background working in museums. I worked at a Western History Museum in Los Angeles. And I started a Native American theater company called Native Voices at Theatre. I'm not Native, but our artistic director was Choctaw. It's just celebrated its 27th anniversary. And when I came back east and started on this project, it was really critical to engage with the local tribes that are there. So before at the beginning of every river festival, we have the Piscataway tribe. The current chiefs of the Piscataway tribe come and make sure that folks, particularly out here, I think out west, it's much more front and center, the Native presence, right? Not so much back east, so that's a great opportunity, I think, to really engage. One of our pieces of art a 60-foot-long mural that's on the Navy Yard side will be of the co-chiefs of the Piscataway tribe, as well as one of our staff at one of our farms, who's a long-term resident east of the river. So, and then I also think that, you know, when you come to a space, there's 100 things that tell you whether it's for you or not, right? Some of which are very obvious and some of which are more subconscious. But, you know, if you came to the cafe at the Bridge Park after it opens and we're selling $27 mahi-mahi tacos, right? Like, that sends a very important message, like who this park is for. So we're not going to, as delicious, I'm sure, as mahi-mahi tacos are going to be, we're not necessarily selling those, right? We have to make sure that the public art reflects the communities that we serve, that our staff reflects the community that we serve, and just as important, all of our programming that we're already starting to work on right now, in our amphitheater and at the community front porch and in the Anacostia Plaza continues to reflect the community that we serve. Lastly, I'll mention is that we are, as I mentioned, some of the public art, have invested some pretty significant time and resources to have art on both sides of the river that acts as these sort of moments where it sort of softens the pedestrian experience to come down to the park. We've collaborated, we're on the west side of the river. It's the oldest operating Navy base in the United States, the U.S. Navy Yard. And we worked, it was such a treat for me as a history geek. We worked with the historian from the Navy Yard to cull through historic images. And then we installed this giant art, the piece that's still up today, if you go down to see it. It's called Behind These Walls, that are these giant murals that are on the walls that talk about President Lincoln used to come down to the Navy Yard every week, and he would experiment with armaments, with Commander Dahlgren, until one day one of their rudimentary rockets blew up, and Mary Todd Lincoln said, "No more, Abraham, you're not going down to play with Commodore Dahlgren anymore. We can't blow yourself up." But that's the kind of history, right, that we're trying to front load. So a little bit of a rambling answer, but I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Yep. Great question. So we, for a while, was a royal we. It was me volunteering for 2 years, right? A sort of labor of love. But I had a choice to either start my own nonprofit or become part of a larger nonprofit. So there's an organization that runs the largest collaboration of nonprofits of its kind in the country. It's called the Town Hall Education, Arts, and Recreation Campus, or the ARC. 14 nonprofits that are co-located on a single 233,000 square foot campus. It's remarkable. And I've always known of the amazing work of the ARC, but when I learned that the doing business name for the ARC was Building Bridges Across the River, I was like, all right, this is like a not too subtle sign, like it's meant to be. And so I began having conversations with the executive director and the board, and to my real wonderful surprise, in December 2013, Building Bridges Across the River voted to take on the Bridge Park as a project of building bridges. So I'm now the executive vice president of Building Bridges Across the River. I oversee the Bridge Park, which is one of our 5 projects, all of our urban farms, and our development department. We also have a workforce center, the Skyland Workforce Center, and we program the largest theater east of the river, a 365-seat theater that's designed and inspired by the Eisenhower Theater at the Kennedy Center. So when I say that's Building Bridges Across the River. When the park opens in 2028, Building Bridges Across the River, will run it and manage it. The bridge itself is owned by the city, so the park will be owned by DDOT, the District Department of Transportation. But we are, I think next week, knock on wood, should be signing our public space permit that will allow us, it's in essence a lease that will allow us to run and program the park. The city will be responsible for the piers, the pilings, the infrastructure. Bridges need to be inspected every year, that's on the city. But then we will be responsible for everything from on top of the deck. So programming, landscaping, staffing, all the subleases with the cafe, and all of that. So. No, the seed of the idea was when I was working at the National Building. I'll make this story short because I could go on this. But when I was working at the National Building Museum, I brought over the Danish architect and planner Jan Gehl to speak at the museum. Some of you might know his work. Jan writes extensively about designing cities for people. It's very Portland, right? But he's from Copenhagen. And Jan had never connected with our Office of Planning director, a woman by the name of Harriet Tregoning, who's a good friend. And Jan was running a little late for breakfast, and I asked what I thought was an innocent question at the time, which was, "Hey, Harriet, what's happening with all the construction on the 11th Street bridges?" Just making conversations, beware of innocent questions and where they're going to lead you through your career. And Harriet sort of outlined this thought bubble of an idea when the old bridges were coming down, new bridges were coming up, like the High Line had just opened up in New York, and so planning directors were thinking about, how to repurpose infrastructure into new civic spaces. We're now part of a larger group called the High Line Network that's 47 similar transformed infrastructure into parks projects across North America. It's worth checking out. Just Google the High Line Network and it'll pop up. But everybody on Harriet's staff, and she would say this if she was standing next to me, thought she was bananas. And she was like, "Oh, Harriet, get off this bridge park idea." And so she asked me if I could help, if I could volunteer. And it was 7 in the morning, and I clearly had not had enough caffeine that day and was like, how hard can this be 13 years later, right? But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I can't think of another project in the nation's capital that in a single intervention can address and support the community's physical, the emotional, cultural, economic, environmental well-being. And so I was hooked. So it was Harriet's idea, thought bubble of an idea that we've really run with. So, yeah. And a partnership with the city from the beginning. Yeah. Yeah, so the way we structure, and if you come up to me later, happy to share like more written information on this, but we had this group of key stakeholders, who were residents, as well as key federal, the stakeholders. So where the park lands is National Park Service. So we had the superintendent from the National Park Service that participated. We have all these complicated federal design review committees like the National Capital Planning Commission and the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, like they were on the design review committee. And then we went to each of our 13 city council members and we asked them to nominate one of their constituents. Because although this is most directly going to impact the communities on both sides, it was really important that this became a city-owned the piece of infrastructure. So we got 9 of the 13 city council members to nominate one of their constituents. We're in a ward system, so we have 8 wards. The wards that were closest to the bridge got 2 votes and everybody else got 1 because they should have a little bit more of a say, right? And their role was to review the draft design brief, right? This was the Bible that Don and I used to sort of run the design competition. And they gave some pretty significant the changes, right? They interviewed, or they participated in the 6 finalists that we had. And then when we brought it down to 4, each of the 4 design teams, and they were just phenomenal design teams, the requirement was it needed to be a pair of a landscape architect and an architect, because this is, it's both on the bridge. Each of the design teams had 2 4-hour sessions that they could meet with this group of stakeholders. Again, and this was, I think, the thing that in a really positive way kind of freaked out the design teams a little bit, right? Each of the design teams could use those 2 4-hour sessions however they wanted, right? And so some teams used it, like OMA and Olin came in and they had giant models that they ripped apart and reassembled. And I remember Diana Balmori, who was one of the finalists, she led a larger conversation with this amazing sociologist, Mindy Philolove, about gentrification. We had another group that voted on different designs, if my memory serves correctly, using white and green and red Tic Tacs, right? So they all used it in very different ways. But the through line there was that each one of those design teams would have had some significant red flag that the community, that the residents were able to identify, right? And I'll give you an example. Almost each of the teams had these big floating green sort of areas in the river, these floating gardens. And one of our stakeholders was the rowers who were on the river, as well as the boating community. And the rowers said, do you realize where you're going to put those floating gardens is right at our finish line when we have regattas? They were like, so those were gone, right? But the design team got to hear that as part of an iterative process, right? The design oversight committee then used the same criteria as our jury to score each of the 4 final design teams. They participated in the final design review, and then they made a recommendation to the jury. And the jury would have had to have some significant objections, right, to overrule this group of stakeholders. As it turned out, both were unanimous for OMA and Olin. The way we'd structured it too, I mean, not to get too in the weeds, but we did have a governance committee that were comprised of the head of my nonprofit organization and the chief engineer on the DDOT, right, as sort of a safeguard, just to make sure things didn't go totally off the rails. But it was the local residents who really helped shape that. And we had 3 when we got the 4 final designs in, we had 3 exhibitions that were scattered around town, one at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, one at AIADC downtown's offices, one at our facility at the Arc. We partnered with the Washington Post to show all the images online, and we had this online voting system that was probably the most successful at getting the word out, least successful at getting content, because it was just a beauty pageant at that point, right? Because nobody read, they just saw the pretty pictures. So whatever, we put that in. But we really leveraged this to get the entire city excited about it, and I think we're fairly successful. So. Yeah, thank you. Any last question? Yeah. Yeah, it is a complicated piece of infrastructure because it's vertical and horizontal, right? There's the bridge, but then there's buildings on top of the bridge. So DDOT, the District Department of Transportation, will be putting out an open solicitation for a GC. We have a good idea of, we just did our latest cost estimation, and costs are, up and down all over the place, but we've got a pretty good idea of where it's landing. And then we will participate with DDOT to select a prime with significant amount of subs that are part of this. Because there's district money in the project, the district put up half the money for the construction of the park, and we, our nonprofit, put up the other half. So it's about 74 million in neat construction costs, but when you add in design fees and contingencies and management fees, it's about a $92-95 million project. And because there's district money in there, though, there will be local contractors. A third of the contractors need to be local in the district. We have something called first source hiring requirements, that half of the construction crew of our anticipated 268 construction folks who are going to be building this park need to be residents of Washington, D.C. And that's where doing some of these programs well in advance of the construction training programs and working directly with some of the subs well in advance of the park and building their bonding capacity is so important. So thank you again. Thanks for staying on a Friday night. Really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing your wonderful city with us.
Thank you, Scott. Thank all of you for coming and being a part of this. And I think hopefully we will all go away a little bit smarter about what we're doing and how we might go about doing things here in Portland. Scott, thank you again. I'm amazed. I remember when I first came across Scott and this kind of bundle of energy, and he hasn't lost a step in 13 years, I must say. Scott, we have a tradition with CSI that we've borrowed from our Indian friends, native friends around, and that we would like to blanket you and make you a part of our family. So it is.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Welcome to the family.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I think that we have finished our program for tonight. Again, thank you very much for sticking around and being a part of all this. And hopefully we will all do better because of it. Thank you, Scott.